Pacific time or 5:30 a.m. Eastern. So be sure to tune in tomorrow as we share the conclusion of this mission.
And for those of you following along, the Ax-4 crew consists of Commander Peggi Uitson, pilot Shubhandшу Shukla of India, and mission specialists Slavoš Uznanьский-Vishnievski of Poland and Tibor Kapу of Hungary. This Earthbound crew originally lifted off from Launch Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center on Wednesday, June 25th, and arrived at the International Space Station approximately 28 hours later. Now, once docked to the space station, the Ax-4 crew was welcomed aboard by the Expedition 73 crew. And after a brief welcome ceremony that included Commander Uitson awarding Shuks, Slavoš, and Tibor with their orbital astronaut pin, the crew quickly got to work. Now, over the last 2 weeks, it has been such a joy and privilege to see our colleagues, our friends, working through their mission objectives and sharing their stories with groups around the world and making such an impact for their respective countries from space. Now, speaking for the Axiom space teams, we could not be more proud of this crew and everything that they've accomplished. So there are certainly a lot of hugs and handshakes waiting for them when they get home, as well as some well-deserved rest. But before that happens, we get to share their journey back to Earth with all of you, starting right now.
Now, ahead of departure, our teams look at a number of weather items. Some of the obvious ones are no rain or chance of lightning in the recovery zone, both for the safety of the crew inside the spacecraft and the recovery teams on the water. Now, we're also looking for wind speeds less than 10 miles per hour and relatively calm seas so that we can safely perform recovery operations, which includes landing a helicopter on the recovery ship to fly the crew back to shore. Now, once Dragon departs station, the crew's flight home is expected to last approximately 22.5 hours. Dragon will also execute a phasing burn to lower its orbit and line the spacecraft up with its landing locations. These 4 departure burns will gradually increase the distance between the spacecraft and the space station. Dragon will also execute a phasing burn to lower its orbit and line the spacecraft up with its targeted landing location. Then the action starts to pick up pace with trunk separation, closure of the nose cone, a deorbit burn, re-entry, deployment of the drogue and main parachutes, and then finally splashdown off the coast of California. The crew will then get picked up at sea by one of SpaceX's recovery vessels.
And at that point, the Axiom-4 crew will undergo their first medical checks while aboard the recovery vessel before flying on that helicopter back to land. And from there, the crew will be flown to Houston, Texas, where they'll be reunited with their teams. And this welcome home moment, in many ways, will mark the conclusion of the operational phases of this mission.
And guiding us through the action today as Dragon departs station is Anna Schneider with NASA Communications at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. How's it going, Anna?
Hey, Jesse and John, it's good to be with both of you, and welcome to Mission Control Houston at NASA's Johnson Space Center. We're currently live in the International Space Station Flight Control Room, where the Orbit 1 team of flight controllers are being led by NASA Flight Director Allison Bollinger. Earlier this morning, we brought you live coverage of hatch closure, during which the Axiom Mission 4 crew suited up, re-entered Dragon, and closed the hatch between the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft. That hatch closure took place at 4:07 a.m. Central, 5:07 a.m. Eastern. Since that time, the process to depressurize the area between the Dragon hatch and the APAS hatch on station known as the vestibule took place and was recently completed. And now we're waiting undocking in just a little bit, and we will be looking ahead to the go, no-go poll for undocking here in just a few minutes, around 5:50 a.m. Central, 6:50 a.m. Eastern. This final go, no-go poll is where the joint SpaceX and NASA teams make their final call for Dragon to depart the space station. This is one of many checkpoints in that return that will continue all the way up until just before the deorbit burn, giving mission managers multiple chances to assess the weather at the splashdown zones and make sure everything is looking good before Dragon departs. The Axiom Mission 4 crew members, Peggi Uitson, Shubhandшу Shukla, Slavoš Uznanьский-Vисьnevский, and Tibor Kapу are now suited up and standing by for undocking to begin their journey back home to Earth. So again, we'll continue to stand by for that final go, no-go poll in just a couple of minutes, but for now, everything continuing to look good for today's undocking and departure of Axiom Mission 4. Separation today is set for approximately 6:05 a.m. Central, 7:05 a.m. Eastern.
И всем привет, с вами снова я в Спейсе, вы попали на прямую трансляцию. Подождите.
With the undocking procedure.
Всем привет, с вами снова я в Спейсе, вы попали на прямую трансляцию отстыковки пилотируемого космического корабля Crew Dragon C213.1 Grace от Международной космической станции. Вот, сегодня, 14 июля, в 9:20 будете сначала были закрыты люки. Далее отстыковка у нас запланирована на 11:05 по UTC.
To the space station, transferring power, telemetry, and commands between the two vehicles throughout Dragon's stay. Once that complete, Dragon will unlock...
После выполнения серии импульсов для удаления от станции, Dragon выполнит несколько маневров снижения орбиты, сбросит свой грузовой отсек и в 5:37 по UTC завтра, 15 июля, сойдет с орбиты Земли и войдет в атмосферу Земли для приводнения у побережья Калифорнии через 22,5 часа, примерно в 6:30 UTC 15 июля. На борту космического корабля находятся астронавты Axiom-4 Пегги Уитсон, Шубхандшу Шукла, Славош Узнаньский-Висьневский и Тибор Капу, которые летели на космическую станцию на корабле Dragon, когда Falcon 9B10 94.2 запустил космический корабль со стартовой площадки LC-39 в космическом центре Кеннеди во Флориде в среду 25 июня в 6:31 по UTC. Изначально возвращение планировалось на 12 июля, но в итоге миссию продлили на 2 дня еще. И у нас остается порядка 10 минут до отстыковки.
Dragon copies 11:10 Zulu for undocked departure time.
And we just heard some comms between the SpaceX core or the crew operations resource engineer on the ground at SpaceX Mission Control in Hawthorne, California, and Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Uitson currently on board the Dragon Grace spacecraft. They did confirm that undock today is going to be delayed by about 10 minutes. Planning for the undock command to now be sent at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern, which would put a physical separation from station at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern, and this is to allow some final configuration and also to improve the communications between the ground due to some loss of signals that are planned from the original undock time. And the undock window for today does run for about an hour, so the latest that the undock command can be sent is 7 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Eastern, so there's still plenty of margin to continue through the undocking procedure today. So after the undock command is sent at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern to begin the autonomous sequence, the first step in that sequence will be for the umbilicals to retract. These umbilicals connect Dragon's system to the space station and transfer power, telemetry, and commands between the two vehicles during Dragon's stay. And then once those umbilicals have retracted, Dragon will unlatch itself from the space station by releasing the 12 hard capture hooks in 2 separate phases, 6 hooks each. All of that combined will take roughly 4.5 minutes to complete, and then Dragon will be ready to depart from the space station and begin to push itself further and further away by using its thrusters. Again, that physical separation is now planned for 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. Well, it's been a busy morning here in Mission Control Houston. In anticipation of today's undocking, the Axiom Mission 4 crew has also been busy on board the station today and over the past few days preparing for their return home. Over the last several days, the astronauts worked to pack Dragon full of cargo for the return journey. Along with the Axiom Mission 4 crew, Dragon will return with more than 580 pounds of cargo and science back to Earth. This cargo includes 60 scientific experiments, some hardware, and other items. All of this cargo will then get offloaded after the SpaceX recovery teams get the crew out following splashdown. Again, that splashdown is targeted for tomorrow, July 15th. And then once the cargo is offloaded, the scientific samples will be sent to researchers for final analysis. Ahead of hatch closure earlier this morning, again, which took place at 4:07 a.m. Central, 5:07 a.m. Eastern. The crew also took time to get into their SpaceX launch and entry suits. They got those all unpacked and ready for the journey home, and then they suited up. Once they were suited up, that hatch closure took place, and then a depressurization of the vestibule occurred. The vestibule is the area between the Dragon hatch and the APAS hatch on station. This depressurization process lasted about an hour to bring the vestibule down to vacuum in preparation of Dragon's departure, and then a series of leak checks were conducted. During the hatch close operations earlier this morning, the teams also configured what is known as the Big Loop, and this is an integrated communications loop with NASA's Mission Control team here in Houston, along with SpaceX's Mission Control team in Hawthorne, the crew on board the International Space Station, and the Axiom-4 crew currently inside the Dragon Grace spacecraft. This big loop allows for fully integrated communications with Dragon as the crew undocks and makes its way back to Earth. Again, we're targeting that undocking to take place at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern, with the undock command sent 5 minutes before that at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern. Again, we are continuing to stand by for the go, no-go poll. This final poll will take place between the joint NASA and SpaceX teams to ensure all mission managers and flight controllers are prepared for today's undocking and that the International Space Station and Dragon systems are all configured and ready to support the operational activities that will lead to the departure of the Axiom-4 crew, wrapping up an 18-day docked mission aboard the International Space Station. And there on your screen, you're currently seeing a live view inside the Dragon spacecraft. The Dragon spacecraft docked to the space station's Harmony module, the space-facing port of the Harmony module, on June 26th. This over-the-shoulder view is in between Commander Peggi Uitson and pilot Shubhandшу Shukla. Again, the crew got suited up a couple of hours ago during those hatch close operations. They will remain in their suits through the undocking and departure activities today. Once they exit the approach ellipsoid, which is one of the invisible boundaries around the International Space Station that governs visiting vehicles, the crew will begin to take off those suits and get comfortable for their 22.5-hour journey home. They will then put those suits back on just ahead of the deorbit and entry phase of their flight tomorrow morning. Since launching to the International Space Station on June 25th, the crew has spent a total of 20 days in space. 18 of those days were spent docked to the International Space Station conducting research and outreach activities. Commander Peggy Uitson, and also a former NASA astronaut, following this mission and splashdown tomorrow morning, will have spent 695 days in space across 5 flights, which places her 7th on the all-time list for cumulative days in space. Again, we are continuing to stand by for that final go, no-go poll. For those of you who are just joining us, we are providing live coverage of the Axiom mission for undocking and departure activities. The undocking is now slated to take place at 6:15 a.m. Central with physical separation, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. Following that separation, there will be a series of departure burns. After the second departure burn, known as Depart Burn 1, Dragon will then exit the keep-out sphere. That will take place around 6:21 a.m. Central, 7:21 a.m. Eastern. About 13 minutes after that keep-out sphere exit will be the approach ellipsoid exit around 6:34 a.m. Central, 7:34 a.m. Eastern, which will set Dragon and the Axiom Mission 4 crew back on their journey home to Earth. And we're currently going through a brief but expected handover between satellites. This causes a loss of signal from station and the Dragon cameras. But currently on your screen, you see a dual view with the SpaceX Mission Control room in Hawthorne, California on the left-hand side of your screen, and the International Space Station Flight Control Room here at Mission Control Houston on the right-hand side of your screen. Both of these teams currently working in tandem through today's joint operations. Those joint operations will conclude after Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, which is one of the invisible boundaries around the International Space Station that governs visiting vehicles when they are arriving and departing from the orbiting laboratory. And we are now about 5 minutes away from the new undocking command time. That time is slated for 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern. 5 minutes after the undock command is sent, we will have physical separation. Again, that physical separation from the space station is now scheduled for 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. And just like during its approach to the International Space Station, Dragon's departure and deorbit is fully autonomous, requiring no action from the crew on board. Once the undock command is sent in just about 4 minutes from now, that will begin that autonomous sequence, and the first step is for the umbilicals to retract. That will be followed by the hooks opening. There are 12 total hooks. Those will open in 2 separate phases of 6. And then we will have that physical separation following 2 short undock burns. And the teams here on the ground are completing that go, no-go poll now.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Ground is go for undocking. The undock sequence start time is 11:10 Zulu.
Copy, 11:10 Zulu. Advisors are closed and secured, and we are go for undock.
SpaceX copies. Visors closed and secured, and Dragon crew is go for undock.
And we just heard confirmation there that the teams on the ground, as well as the Axiom-4 crew currently on Dragon and ready for their departure from station, are all go to proceed with today's undocking and departure. So with that go, we are now just awaiting the undocking sequence to actually begin. Again, that undock command is scheduled to be sent in just about 2 minutes from now at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern. And once that command is sent, it'll take about 5 minutes for Dragon to separate from the International Space Station, with physical separation planned for 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. Dragon's initial departure from station is a little different from other docked vehicles like the Soyuz that rely on springs to push them away from the docking port. Dragon will actually execute 2 short thruster firings called undock burns to physically separate using a combination of the 12 Draco engines around the base of the spacecraft, with the first breaking any stiction between Dragon and the docking port, and the second slowly backing the spacecraft away from the station's Harmony module. Following physical separation, we will have depart burn 0, which is the first of 4 departure burns to begin moving Dragon further away from station. Depart burn 0 will be followed by the second departure burn about 5 minutes later and help move the spacecraft beyond the keep-out sphere. The keep-out sphere is an invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station, and it is one of several safety zones set up to govern spacecraft arriving and departing the space station. Before moving into the keep-out sphere, spacecraft have to be configured where they would not cross the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. About 13 minutes after exiting the keep-out sphere, the Dragon will then exit the approach ellipsoid, which is another imaginary shape, this time a 3-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers in the same family as the keep-out sphere. One of the key differences with the approach ellipsoid is that vehicles outside of it have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory, which means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours, again, even if it lost all maneuvering. Again, we are now standing by for that undocking sequence to begin in just a few moments at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, undock sequence commanded.
And we just got confirmation that that undock sequence has been sent, and the umbilicals are now retracting. With that undock command sent, that undocking sequence has now commenced, and that is a roughly 4.5-minute process before we have that physical separation planned for 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern.
Umbilical demate complete and nominal.
And we have confirmation that those umbilicals have demated or detached from the space station, and the first set of hooks is now traveling. Again, there are 2 sets of 6 hooks for a total of 12 hard capture hooks that have to unlatch and drive open. After all 12 of those hooks are open, we will then have those very short thruster firings known as undock burns to physically separate from station. We're now just over 1 minute into that undock sequence. Again, that sequence takes about 4.5 minutes total, so about 3.5 minutes to go. In that sequence, the first set of hooks is currently driving open. After that first set is open, we will then stand by for the second set of 6 hooks to open. And then there will be those 2 short thruster firings to physically separate Dragon from the International Space Station. And there on your screen, you are currently seeing a live view inside the SpaceX Mission Control Room in Hawthorne, California, as well as the International Space Station Flight Control Room here in Houston, Texas, as the flight controllers on the ground continue to work in tandem to support today's undocking and departure activities of Axiom Mission 4 crew from the International Space Station. And we are currently in a handover period between satellites, which is why we don't currently have live views of Dragon from space station.
First set of hooks, open and nominal.
And we have confirmation that that first set of 6 hooks has now fully opened, and now the second set of 6 hooks is beginning to retract. After that second set of hooks opens, we will then have those short thruster firings and have physical separation. We are now about 4 minutes into that autonomous undocking sequence that began at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern. We are standing by for physical separation here in just under a minute at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern, once the final set of 6 hooks has fully retracted.
All hooks now open and nominal.
Duration confirmed.
And Dragon Grace has
Dragon separation confirmed.
И есть отстыковка пилотируемого космического корабля Crew Dragon C213.1 Grace от Международной космической станции. Вот мы видим нашу новую телеметрию. Высота 413 км, скорость 26 508 км в час. И справа мы видим телеметрию работы двигателей. Но не могу вам это показать, потому что... Ой, ну короче, потом все объясню как-то. И вот, да. Надо просто кое-что на ПК делать, и вот поэтому, да, будете просто слушать вот этот ужас.
And then the next departure burn, depart burn 1, will take place in about 5 minutes. After that departure burn is complete, Dragon will cross the keep out sphere. And with the undocking about a minute ago at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern, the Axiom Mission 4 crew comprised of The Axiom Mission 4 crew comprised of Peggi Uitson, Shubhandшу Shukla, Slavosh Uznanьский-Висьневский, and Tibor Kappu have completed their 18-day stay aboard the International Space Station. So following the physical separation, we did have the first depart burn complete, known as depart burn 0. That was a short firing of Dragon's Draco thrusters, and it lasted approximately 16 seconds. And that burn was to increase the speed that Dragon is flying away from the station and send it further away from the orbiting laboratory. That departure burn will be followed
Houston
in
Station,
about 3 minutes.
thrusters are enabled.
Houston copies.
The depart burn 0 will be followed by the second departure burn in just about 3 minutes around 6:20 a.m. Central, 7:20 a.m. Eastern, known as depart burn 1, and that will help move the spacecraft beyond the keep out sphere. And just a moment ago, you were hearing some communication between the Capcom or capsule communicator here in Mission Control Houston and the crew aboard the International Space Station. Currently on board the International Space Station, NASA astronaut Anne McClain was on tap to monitor and support Dragon's departure activities today. So once that second departure burn is completed in a couple of minutes from now, the Dragon and Axiom Mission 4 crew will move beyond the keep out sphere, and the keep out sphere is that invisible 200-meter line.
Ax-4 crew wants to thank you very much for your support. You guys are amazing.
And you just heard some kind words from Axiom Mission 4 Commander, thanking the flight control team for all of their support throughout their 18-day
Our
mission.
friendship and goodwill forever be an example of the good that results from shared optimism. Axiom-4, Godspeed, and safe journey home to the best planet in the solar system.
Space copies.
And some additional congratulatory and departure words from the International Space Station crew to the Axiom Mission 4 crew on board Dragon as it continues its departure from the International Space Station. Again, we had that physical separation take place about 4 minutes ago at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. And we are standing by for the second in a series of 4 departure burns to take place in about 1 minute from now, and this will push the Dragon spacecraft and the Axiom Mission 4 crew beyond the keep out sphere. That keep out sphere is the invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station, and it is one of several safety zones set up to govern spacecraft arriving and departing from the space station. Before moving into the keep out sphere, spacecraft have to be configured where they would not cross the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. We are now about 10 seconds away from that second departure burn. Dragon is currently about 80 meters away from the International Space Station as it continues its departure. And depart burn 1, again, that second departure burn in a series of 4 is now underway, and it'll last about 20 seconds.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, depart burn 1 complete and nominal. You are go to DOF suits per procedure 4.012.
Nominal departure and 4012 for Dragon.
And we just had confirmation there that that second departure burn, known as depart burn 1, has completed, and it was executed as expected. The crew is now going to start doffing or removing their spacesuits and getting settled in for their 22.5-hour journey back to Earth, again with that splashdown targeted for tomorrow morning, July 15th, off the coast of California. And as a reminder, just like during its approach to the International Space Station, Dragon's departure and deorbit is designed to be fully autonomous, requiring no action from the crew on board. However, unlike Dragon's arrival, there are no hold points during the departure sequence, therefore it takes a lot less time to leave the vicinity of the space station than to arrive. So we just had confirmation of that second departure burn being completed, and that is the second in a series of 4. However, it's the only one that was left within the vicinity of the space station. The next departure burn will take place about 45 minutes from now, after Dragon is well on its way back to Earth and outside of the approach ellipsoid. Dragon is now about 195 meters away from the International Space Station and should be crossing the keep out sphere momentarily. And we just heard confirmation that Dragon has exited the keep out sphere. Again, the keep out sphere is an invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station. It's one of several safety zones set up to govern spacecraft arriving and departing from the International Space Station. While spacecraft are inside the keep out sphere, they have to be configured where they would not cross into the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. The next major milestone for Dragon's departure will be exiting the approach ellipsoid. This is planned to take place about 13 minutes from now.
Dragon Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon has exited the keep out sphere.
Dragon copies.
Station copies.
The station looks beautiful.
Dragon Grace, if we didn't have a shutter constraint, you could see us waving.
All right, great copy.
So now that Dragon has exited the keep out sphere, the next major milestone for Dragon is crossing the approach ellipsoid. That will take place a little over 10 minutes from now. That approach ellipsoid is another imaginary shape similar to the keep out sphere, but this time it's a 3-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. And one of the key differences with the approach ellipsoid is that vehicles outside of it have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. This means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours, even if it lost all maneuvering. After the spacecraft crosses the approach ellipsoid, joint operations will end, and responsibility for the spacecraft will be handed back to the SpaceX flight control team in Hawthorne, California. Again, everything continuing to look good with Dragon's departure today, following a physical separation about 10 minutes ago at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. Dragon is now about 340 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to increase that distance. And teams on the ground will continue to monitor the weather ahead of a splashdown tomorrow, Tuesday, July 15th at 5:31 a.m. Eastern off the coast of California. After Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, there will be a couple of more departure burns and phasing burns to set the spacecraft up for the correct phasing and location for splashdown. And for those of you who are just joining us, the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft carrying the Axiom-4 crew recently undocked from the International Space Station's Harmony module at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern to complete an 18-day stay aboard the orbiting laboratory.
Station Houston on the big loop. Johnny, please give Huntsville a call on Space to Ground 4.
Dragon lifted off atop a Falcon 9 rocket on Wednesday, June 25th from Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida and docked to the space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module after a 28-hour journey on Thursday, June 26th. During their stay aboard the International Space Station, the Axiom-4 crew conducted more than 60 experiments, and they will now be returning to Earth with more than 580 pounds of science and hardware. This was the fourth private astronaut mission to the International Space Station enabled by NASA. And while Dragon and the Axiom-4 crew continue their departure from station, and as we stand by for the approach ellipsoid exit in just under 10 minutes from now, let's go ahead and check back in with Jesse and John in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Anna. We've got some great live views here. Previously, we didn't have any live views because we had a loss of signal, which is normal as we are passing by several ground stations. We're now passing over a ground station where we do have acquisition of signal and getting these great live views. Also, in your bottom right-hand corner, you can follow along with this new graphic and see the thrusters firing on Dragon on the forward bulkhead, as well as the telemetry in the bottom left-hand corner. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Dragon is fully autonomous, which means it's capable of flying itself. Dragon was designed from the beginning for flying humans to space, even though its first missions carried only cargo. Now, before we could fly humans, our teams implemented a number of design upgrades to make sure that both Dragon and Falcon 9 are suitable for flying people, and then put both vehicles through thousands of tests to prove their safety. Now, prior to the Axiom-4, SpaceX successfully completed 52 flights of Dragon to and from orbit since 2010, including 47 trips to the International Space Station. Ax-4 is SpaceX's 18th human spaceflight mission, and before Axiom-4, SpaceX had flown 66 crew members, meaning that this mission brings that count to 70.
That's incredible. You know, missions like this are important milestones for everyone involved, from the crew members who fly to those that they represent, and to the host of scientists and engineers around the world who have an opportunity for their research or their technology to be tested in microgravity. Everyone learns from these missions. And for Axiom Space, this is at the heart of why we do these missions. We are building opportunities for others to advance what is possible and expand what is known. We want to enable every human everywhere to take part in this. Now, after a beautiful launch on June 25th, the Ax-4 crew docked with the International Space Station a little over a day later, opening the hatch and greeting the Expedition 73 crew on June 26th. The crew shared some good words and a welcoming ceremony before quickly getting to work on their extensive itinerary. Now, each crew member brought with them a host of research, technology demonstrations, and outreach objectives, ranging from human physiology to space radiation impact studies, and even some gardening. Now, this crew maintained a very full timeline, but they prepared for this. Each crew member wanted to ensure that every minute of this mission was utilized well and that all objectives were hit. So Peggy, Shooks, Suave, and Tibor were ready to work. And over the course of 18 days on board the station, they accomplished over 60 research activities, as well as more than 20 outreach events. And as their time on station came to a close, the Ax-4 crew participated in a brief farewell ceremony where they said their goodbyes to the Expedition 73 crew. Now, for more details on the incredible work performed by this crew on orbit, check out axiomspace.com.
Now, at this time, the crew is getting closer to reaching the approach ellipsoid, so let's head back to Anna at Johnson Space Center to step through these next moments. How's it going, Anna?
Thanks, Jesse and John, and thank you for that update. We are continuing to stand by for Dragon to exit the approach ellipsoid. We are expecting that exit to take place about 3 minutes from now, around 6:34 a.m. Central, 7:34 a.m. Eastern. Dragon is currently about 700 meters away from the International Space Station, following a physical separation about 16 minutes ago at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. The approach ellipsoid is one of several safety zones set up to govern spacecraft arriving and departing from the International Space Station, similar to the keep-out sphere, which Dragon exited about 10 minutes ago at 6:21 a.m. Central, 7:21 a.m. Eastern. But unlike the keep-out sphere, which is an invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station, the approach ellipsoid is a three-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. When a spacecraft is outside the approach ellipsoid, they have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. This means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours again, even if it lost all maneuvering. And after the crew and Dragon exited the keep-out sphere about 10 minutes ago, we heard that the crew was beginning to step through procedures to take off their spacesuits and settle in for their roughly 22.5-hour journey until a splashdown off the coast of California tomorrow, Tuesday, July 15th. And we are just continuing to stand by for confirmation of approach ellipsoid exit. Once Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, the team here in Mission Control Houston will continue to monitor every step of the way, but prime responsibility once they exit that boundary will be transferred to the SpaceX and Axiom space teams. Dragon is now about 860 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to increase that distance between the two vehicles. And we're now about a minute away from exiting the approach ellipsoid. For those of you who are just joining us, we began our coverage of the Axiom mission for departure activities earlier this morning with hatch closure. That hatch close took place around 4:07 a.m. Central, 5:07 a.m. Eastern. The crew donned or put on their spacesuits and settled in for the departure activities.
I have you loud and clear on the cabin mic.
And we did just hear confirmation that Dragon has exited the approach ellipsoid.
On the big loop, I copied you loud and clear on the cabin mic. Dragon is also outside of the approach ellipsoid and is now on a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. You can configure comm on Dragon to ground in preparation for disabling the big loop.
Dragon copies all and configuring comms for Dragon to ground.
Now that Dragon and the Axiom Mission 4 crew have exited the approach ellipsoid, that means the vehicle is now on a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory, which means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours again, even if it lost all maneuvering. So now that the crew and Dragon have exited the approach ellipsoid, they are settling in for their journey back to Earth. That journey will take about 22 more hours until they splash on.
Is reconnected and powered on.
Houston copies.
That journey will take about 22 more hours until they splash down off the coast of California tomorrow, Tuesday, July 15th at 4:31 a.m. Central, 5:31 a.m. Eastern. Now that Dragon has exited the approach ellipsoid, the team here in Mission Control Houston will continue to monitor, but prime responsibility for the spacecraft and the crew are going to be transferred to the SpaceX and Axiom space teams. We also heard that they are working on steps to deconfigure the big loop. That big loop was configured earlier today during those hatch close operations, and it is a joint communication loop between NASA, SpaceX, the International Space Station crew, and the Dragon crew during joint operations. Now that Dragon has successfully exited the approach ellipsoid, our joint coverage will come to a close as responsibility of the spacecraft and crew is now in the hands of SpaceX and Axiom Space. But thank you so much for joining us this morning for our coverage of hatch closure as well as our coverage of undocking for the Axiom Mission 4 crew. With that, I will go ahead and hand it back over to Jesse and John in Hawthorne, California as we conclude our coverage. But until next time, this is Mission Control Houston.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. Now, the Axiom Mission 4 crew has just begun their 22.5-hour journey. So next up, the crew will doff or remove their spacesuits to get a little bit more comfortable for that flight back home. Our teams here on the ground will continue to keep an eye on the weather to ensure a safe return to Earth for Dragon and the Ax-4 crew. And should the current projections hold, starting at 4:28 a.m. Eastern Time, or 1:28 a.m. Pacific Time on Tuesday, July 15th, Axiom Space and SpaceX will pick up with live coverage of the conclusion of this Ax-4 mission.
That's right, and should teams need to adjust the timing of the crew's return, it's our plan to go live about an hour before splashdown. So for the latest timing of the final stage of the Ax-4 journey, please be sure to visit axiomspace.com and spacex.com for updates. So from all of us at Axiom Space, thank you to NASA for the incredible efforts made on this mission towards the shared goal of conducting meaningful work in low Earth orbit. This has been the mission to realize the return to human spaceflight for 3 incredible nations with big things on the horizon. So to our viewers in India, Poland, and Hungary, your crew members will be back on Earth soon, so stay tuned. And thank you for following their journey on board the International Space Station.
And thank you to all of you, the viewers, for tuning in today. We'll see you back here bright and early tomorrow morning for a splashdown of Ax-4.